The 9th day. That was the number on the wall when the cold finally stopped pretending it could beat her. Ada Voss pressed the charcoal stub against the stone and drew a careful mark beside the 8 that came before it. 9 vertical lines. 9 mornings she had woken in this place instead of the frozen ground outside. 9 days since Coldridge Camp had decided what she was worth and found the answer to be nothing. Outside, the temperature had fallen to somewhere near 22 below zero. She knew this not by feeling had become unreliable in the cold, but by the small alcohol thermometer she kept wrapped in oilcloth on the highest shelf, the one place in the chamber that stayed genuinely dry. She checked it every morning before she did anything else, before she added wood to the fire, before she ate, before she allowed herself to think about what the day required. 22 below outside, 52 degrees in her sleeping enclosure. 1 bundle of wood for the night. Smoke clean, hides dry. She wrote these numbers in a careful column beneath the 9th mark and set the charcoal down. Then she looked at the fire. It burned low and steady, the way she had learned to make it burn, drawing clean air up through the vent passage she had cleared on the 3rd day. No smoke pooling along the ceiling, no wasted heat climbing straight out before it could do any work. The numbers did not tell the story of how she had gotten here. They did not need to. Numbers did not carry shame or anger, or the particular sound a labor contract makes when a man tears it in half in front of 40 people who choose to look at the floor rather than at you. Numbers only told the truth about what existed, what remained, and what the next hour required. Ada Voss had been keeping numbers for 4 years. She was rather good at it by now. Rewind. Back to the beginning. Back to the morning it all came apart. Coldridge Camp sat at the northern end of Sawtooth Hollow, Idaho Territory, in the shadow of a ridgeline that blocked the sun until nearly 10 in the morning from October through March. The camp had been built for timber, expanded for profit, and maintained through a system of labor contracts that Harlan Drum had spent 15 years perfecting. The contracts were works of careful architecture. They were built to look like opportunity and function like a trap. A man or a woman arrived at Coldridge owing a debt. Transportation costs, supply fees, the administrative expense of the contract itself, which was considerable, always itemized and non-negotiable. Once inside the system, the debt had a way of remaining precisely far enough ahead of the wages to prevent anyone from reaching the end of it. Harlan Drum did not need fences. He did not need locks on the outer gates. He only needed people to believe that leaving meant owing, and that owing without the camp's protection meant dying alone in the Idaho winter. He was not wrong about the dying part. Ada had arrived at Coldridge 4 years earlier, at the age of 16, 2 weeks after her parents were buried in shallow ground along the Boise River, taken by the same fever that had cleared out half the wagon party they had traveled west with. She had no money, no family within 1,200 miles, and no particular plan beyond the immediate problem of surviving until spring. Harlan Drum had offered her a contract. She had signed it. She had spent the 4 years since learning exactly how the numbers worked. This was the thing that made Ada Voss unusual at Coldridge, and the thing that had eventually made her useful to Harlan Drum, and the thing that had finally, in the end, made her dangerous to his son. Ada could read. She could write. And she could hold figures in her head with the kind of steady precision that her mother, a schoolteacher's daughter from western Pennsylvania, had spent years instilling in her. By her 2nd year at the camp, Ada was keeping the supply ledgers. By her 3rd, she was weighing flour, counting rations, and cross-referencing the purchase orders against what actually arrived on the freight wagons. She knew every number in that camp. She knew what came in and what went out, and what the difference between the two was supposed to be. She knew it better than Harlan Drum knew it himself. He was good with contracts. He was not particularly good with arithmetic. This had never been a problem because Ada had never given him a reason to think about it. She cooked meals. She carried ledgers. She kept her head down and her mouth closed, and she watched the debt number at the top of her account page the way a patient woman watches a door she believes will eventually open. There were people at Coldridge who were kind to her in the particular careful way that kindness operated in a place like that quietly, with one eye always on who might be watching. Bethel Webb was the camp laundress, a widow in her mid-40s with rough hands and a way of noticing things without appearing to look at them. She had repaired a torn sleeve of Ada's, once folding the mended garment onto Ada's bunk before dawn so that no one saw the transaction. She had given Ada the last of a tin of dried apple slices one December when the supply wagon was 3 weeks late and everyone was cutting portions. She had never once asked for anything in return, and Ada had understood instinctively that this was the highest form of generosity available inside Coldridge's walls. Stellan Marsh was newer. He had arrived in September of 1888, hired to teach reading and arithmetic to the children of the camp workers through the winter months. He was a quiet man, somewhere in his middle 30s, with the particular quality of attention that belonged to people who had learned long ago that watching carefully was more useful than speaking quickly. He sat in the back of rooms. He noticed exits. He had a habit of looking at hands before he looked at faces. Ada had noticed him noticing. She had not decided yet what to make of that. And then there was Preston Drum. Harlan's son was 26 years old and had inherited his father's talent for self-presentation without inheriting anything resembling his father's patience. Where Harlan controlled through structure, Preston controlled through chaos, through the sudden shift in mood that kept people slightly off balance, through the charm that appeared and vanished so quickly that you were never quite sure whether you had imagined it. He disappeared from camp on evenings when the ore wagons stopped overnight. He returned in the early morning hours, smelling of whiskey and something harder to name. Ada had seen him slip into the camp storehouse twice after closing hours, on nights when the main ledger showed no reason for an inventory check. She had not reported what she saw. In Coldridge, the word of an indentured woman carried less weight than the word of a landowner's son by approximately the same margin that the sun outweighed a candle. This was not a complaint. It was arithmetic. Ada understood arithmetic. What she had not fully understood until the morning of October the 28th was how precisely Preston had been watching her back. The payroll box arrived on a Tuesday. It came with a man named Corder Gant, the foreman of a silver mining operation called the Silver Run Outfit, who was stopping at Coldridge for a single overnight before continuing south. The box was walnut, approximately 18 inches long, fitted with an iron handle and a brass lock. Corder Gant wore the key to that lock on a cord around his neck beneath his shirt, and he did not remove it once during the evening meal or the conversation that followed. He handed the box to Harlan Drum for safekeeping with the particular careful handshake of a man who is trusting someone he does not entirely trust and knows it. Harlan locked the box in his office. Corder Gant ate supper in the mess hall, spoke to no one at length, and went to sleep in the guest quarters with the key still around his neck. Inside the box was the monthly wages for 32 miners' coin script and 2 sealed pay envelopes for the shift supervisors. That same evening, Preston Drum sat down at a card table in the back room of a freight outpost a quarter mile from the camp's eastern gate. He lost steadily, then heavily, and by 11 o'clock he owed a sum to 2 teamsters that represented approximately 4 months of any reasonable wage. The teamsters were not interested in reasonable wages. They were interested in payment before sunrise and in the specific threat they had constructed, which involved telling Harlan Drum everything they knew about his son's financial habits in detail in front of witnesses. Preston left the card table at 11:40. He retrieved the spare office key from the shallow drawers on the left side of his father's desk where it had lived for 11 years. He unlocked the office. He carried the walnut payroll box to the abandoned weighing shed at the edge of the campyard, where the scale machinery had been removed 2 seasons earlier and the floorboards had been left to settle unevenly into the frozen ground. Using a short pry tool, he lifted one of the boards near the north wall. He placed the box in the hollow beneath. He replaced the board. He took a handful of silver coin from the box, first enough to silence the teamsters until a longer solution could be arranged, and he slipped a single piece of Silver Run payroll script from the box's interior envelope. He crossed the yard to the women's quarters. He found Ada's sewing kit where it always was in the left side of her storage trunk, beneath the bunk beside the mending thread and the bone needle case her mother had given her. He placed the Silver Run script inside the kit between two folded squares of cotton batting where it would be found easily once someone knew to look. He walked back across the yard. The snow had covered his tracks by the time he reached the bunkhouse steps. He slept 4 hours. When he woke, he replaced the spare key in the drawer before Harlan rose, then was the first person to report seeing Ada near the office the previous evening. Ada was in the kitchen when Corder Gant discovered the box was missing. She heard the sound of boots moving quickly across the frozen yard. Too many boots moving with the particular urgency that meant something had gone wrong. And she set down the ladle she was holding and wiped her hands on her apron and stood very still for a moment in the way that people stand when they have learned to assess a situation before they step into it. She did not know yet that the situation was about to step into her. The search was efficient. Harlan organized it himself, which meant it followed a certain logic, his logic which began with the assumption that the answer was already known and worked backward from there. The women's quarters were searched third after the guest room and the main office. It took less than 4 minutes to find the Silver Run script in Ada's sewing kit. She looked at it when they held it up. She looked at it the way you look at a thing that could not possibly be where it is. And then she understood what that meant, and she made herself very calm. She asked 3 questions. The first, the brass lock on the payroll box, showed no damage. The box had been opened with a key. Corder Gant had worn the only issued key around his neck. Through the entire night, had anyone checked whether the camp's spare office key was truly in the drawer? All evening, or merely returned there before dawn. The second, there were boot prints in the mud along the north side of the office wall, still visible despite the overnight snow because the overhang had protected them. Had anyone measured those prints against the boots of everyone in camp? The third, if she had intended to steal the payroll, why would she leave a single piece of traceable script in her own sewing kit, which was the first place any competent searcher would look? Harlan Drum listened to each question with the expression of a man who has already reached his conclusion and finds the subsequent argument mildly irritating. He dismissed the first by saying the spare key had been in the drawer, where it always was. He had checked it himself that morning, not mentioning that by the time he checked, Preston had already replaced it. He dismissed the second by saying the mud was too disturbed to read clearly, which was not precisely true, but was not entirely false either. He dismissed the third by saying that criminals were often not as clever as they believed themselves to be. Corder Gant stood beside Harlan during all of this. He looked at the script. He looked at Ada. The key was still around his neck, warm against his chest, exactly where it had been all night, which meant the box had been opened by the spare, which meant Ada's first question was the only one that actually mattered. He felt this understanding arrive in his chest, and he set it aside because setting it aside was easier than what following it would require. He chose the easy answer. Preston stood behind his father through all of it. He did not look at Ada once. He did not look toward the office where the box had been kept. He looked at a point on the wall approximately 18 inches above and to the left of Ada's head, and he kept his left hand buried in his coat pocket where the fresh scratches from the weighing shed's floorboards were hidden beneath the wool. Stellan Marsh stood in the back corner of the mess hall where the morning meeting had been hastily assembled. He watched Corder look at Ada and look away. He watched Harlan's jaw set with the rigidity of a man performing certainty he had not quite achieved. He watched Preston's left hand in Preston's coat pocket. He watched the way Preston's eyes moved everywhere except the 2 places a genuinely outraged, innocent man would look. And he noticed in the flat, pale morning light coming through the mess hall's east window the fresh abrasions on the back of Preston's left hand. Fine parallel lines raised slightly at the edges. The kind of marks left by rough old wood when you are prying against it in the dark with both hands and cannot afford to let go. He did not say anything. He was new here. He was still understanding the weight of things. Harlan Drum held the judgment in the mess hall that same morning with most of the camp's 43 workers and residents present. He stood at the long table at the north end of the room, the one where morning meals were served and supply disputes were occasionally arbitrated, and he read aloud from Ada's labor contract before he tore it in half. The debt ledger remained on the table in front of him untouched, its continued presence communicating everything that did not need to be said out loud. She was no longer Coldridge's responsibility. She was still Coldridge's debtor. Ada stood in the center of the room and listened. She understood exactly what the untouched ledger meant. Then something happened that Ada had not anticipated and Harlan had not accounted for. Stellan Marsh, standing near the east wall, watched Harlan set the torn contract aside and reach for the debt ledger, not to present it as evidence, but to make a notation, a small adjustment to the figures at the top. Stellan watched the pen move and watched the number change and understood with the precision of a man who taught arithmetic to children and therefore never stopped seeing arithmetic clearly what the adjustment meant. Harlan was not simply recording the loss. He was redistributing it. The figure he wrote into the general supply account was higher than the amount actually missing from the payroll box. The difference would be recovered through the camp's pricing small increases spread across flour, salt, lamp oil, and 3 other staples that every person in Coldridge purchased regularly from the company store. 42 people paying slightly more for everything they needed over a winter season. The mathematics of it were elegant in the way that exploitation is sometimes elegant, invisible, deniable, and profitable. Stellan folded this observation into the back of his mind and did not speak it aloud. Not yet. Bethel Webb was sitting near the east wall on the bench where she always sat, and when Harlan finished speaking, she stood up. She had brought the coat. It had been her husband's, a heavy canvas and wool piece built for genuine cold. The kind of cold that the mountains produced in November and December and January. The kind of cold that the blanket Ada was being allowed to keep would not survive. Bethel Webb had crossed the room with the coat folded over her forearm, and she had gotten to within 6 feet of Ada before Harlan Drum said quietly that anyone who assisted a proven thief would find their own ration allocation reconsidered for the remainder of the winter. The room did not move. Bethel Webb stopped walking. Ada looked at her, just for a moment. Then she looked away because there was nothing either of them could do about it, and looking directly at a kindness you cannot accept is one of the harder things a person can be asked to do. Ada was allowed to keep a wool blanket, a tin cup, a dull kitchen knife, half a loaf of barley bread, and the clothes she was wearing. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders, tucked the bread inside her dress where it would stay dry, set the cup and the knife through her belt, and walked out of the mess hall. She did not look at Preston. She did not look at Harlan. She walked through the camp yard and through the main gate and onto the logging road without stopping. The cold hit her the moment she cleared the windbreak of the outer fence. She had been cold before every winter of the 4 years she had spent at Coldridge in the drafty women's quarters with their inadequate stove and walls that let the wind through at the corners. This was different. This cold was not a presence she shared with 42 other people. This cold was hers alone. She started walking south. The rain came first, an hour. Particular October rain that arrives in the Idaho mountains like a rehearsal for something worse. It soaked through the wool blanket in 40 minutes. The corduroy logging road turned slick with mud. She kept walking. She did not run. Running used heat faster than walking and accomplished approximately the same distance over rough terrain. She needed to be somewhere sheltered before the temperature dropped another 10 degrees, which she estimated based on the smell of the air and the way the wind was coming down through the gaps in the ridge would happen within the next 3 to 4 hours. She conserved strength the way she had learned to conserve flour and lamp oil deliberately, without sentiment, without the belief that the situation would improve on its own. At a fork in the road where 2 skidding trails diverged, she found a fallen pine blocking the lower route. The trunk was 3 feet in diameter, and the bank on either side was soft mud. She turned up the slope. There was no trail above. She climbed anyway, testing each step before weighting it, using the trees as handholds on the steeper sections, stopping every 50 feet to listen. The rain was heavier now. It had begun to carry ice in it. She drank from droplets sliding over an exposed granite face, rather than stopping to find a stream which would have required kneeling in the wet for longer than she wanted. She kept the bread dry inside her dress. She avoided the dark patches of ground that might conceal holes beneath the new snow. She did not think about Coldridge or Harlan or Preston or the debt ledger sitting on that table. She thought about the next 10 feet of ground and what it required. Hours passed. Her hands began losing feeling at the fingertips first, then across the backs. She worked them against each other inside the blanket whenever she stopped trying to maintain circulation without breaking stride for longer than necessary. Her teeth had been clicking together steadily since the rain started, and she had stopped noticing it. The light was going. The sky to the west was the color of a bruise, fading from purple into gray, and the ridge above her was darkening fast, and she understood with complete clarity that she was running out of time. And then she heard water. Not the scattered sound of rain on pine needles or the thin trickle of a hillside seep. This was something deeper and more constant, water striking stone with the weight of real volume, a sound that meant a significant flow, which meant a significant drop, which meant a cliff face, which meant potential shelter. She turned toward it. Not because she felt hope. Hope was a luxury for people who had other options. She turned toward it because it was the only direction left that was not simply lying down. She pushed through the last line of spruce at the edge of the timber and saw Raven fall. The waterfall dropped nearly 50 feet from a black basalt ledge into a stone basin below. The rain had swollen the flow considerably. Wind drove white spray across the lower rocks in a continuous mist that coated everything in cold wet. The sound of it was enormous, deep and physical, something you felt in the chest as much as heard with the ears. At first there was nowhere to hide. The stone face on either side of the falls was vertical and exposed, and the basin below was nothing but spray and churned water. She stood at the edge of the tree line and looked at it for a long moment, her blanket soaked through her hands past reliable sensation. Then she looked at the right edge of the falls, at the place where the water curtain met the cliff. There was a gap, not large a shadow more than anything else. A darkening where the water did not quite cling to the rock face, where an overhanging shelf of basalt created a narrow pocket behind the falling water. You would not see it unless you were looking for it. You would not look for it unless you had run out of other things to look for. Ada had run out of other things. She tied the blanket across her shoulders, with a strip torn from her apron. She used the kitchen knife to test the stability of the rocks along the base of the falls before weighting them, probing for the ones that would hold. The moss-covered surfaces were treacherous. She slipped twice on the approach, once badly enough to send her knee into the stone with a crack. She felt all the way to her hip. She did not stop. She kept moving toward the gap in the curtain with the focused attention of someone who understands that stopping is not a choice available to her. Behind the waterfall, the stone face opened into a crack approximately 3 feet 8 inches high and perhaps 22 inches wide. Cold air drifted from inside, carrying the particular smell of dry earth and old ash and something else, weathered leather animal hide, the residue of fires that had burned here years before anyone living could remember. The crack was too small to walk through upright. Ada dropped to her knees. She shoved the wet blanket ahead of her into the darkness and twisted sideways into the opening. The stone was tight against her shoulders. The sound of the waterfall became a vibration inside the rock rather than a sound in the air. She moved forward on her elbows and knees, not knowing where the passage led. Not knowing whether it opened into anything or simply narrowed to nothing 30 feet in. After the first few yards, the stone beneath her hands became dry. She kept moving. The passage opened upward after perhaps 35 feet, emerging into a stone chamber that she could not see but could sense by the change in air pressure and the way sound moved differently around her. She lay still for a moment on the dry stone floor, breathing, letting the absence of rain and wind register as a physical fact. Then she felt her way along the wall. Her hands found a ring of smoke-blackened stone. An old hearth. Nearby, a dented tinderbox. Inside the tinderbox, dry bark shreds and the edge of a small piece of flint. Her fingers had limited sensation but enough to work with. She struck the flint against the box's iron striker. Nothing on the first attempt. Nothing on the second. On the 6th attempt, a spark caught the bark, and she nursed it with breath so careful it was barely more than a thought, feeding it fragments of the driest material she could find by touch. And after 4 minutes, a small flame stood in the darkness. She held it up and looked at what time had left behind. Stake holes in the floor where posts had once stood. Elevated storage shelves, most now sagged or collapsed. A shallow depression at the far end of the chamber, lower than the main floor. Rotting basket fragments. 5 rolled hides in varying states of decay, 3 of them too far gone to be useful. Small jars and crocks, most cracked or empty, but 3 still sealed. A flat piece of deer hide, stretched and dried, covered in marking symbols representing water and wind and elevation lines and shapes that were not a language she could read, but were clearly a system of some kind made by people who understood this mountain in ways she was only beginning to imagine. Bone needles, thin sheets of mica, a rusted trapper's knife, and on the highest shelf, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, a small alcohol thermometer with the year 1879 scratched into its brass case. She looked at it all for a long moment. This was not a treasure. It was the remains of a system built by people who had understood the mountain as a problem to be solved, with patience and accumulated knowledge, and then left behind when those people were gone, with only the tools remaining to suggest what they had known. Much of it was ruined. Much of it would not serve her, but some of it would. She set the flame inside the old hearth ring and fed it carefully with wood from the desiccated piles stored beneath the raised shelf wood that had been there long enough to be genuinely dry. She let the fire build slowly, testing the drawer, watching whether the smoke moved upward or pooled along the ceiling. For the moment, it moved upward. She held her hands close to the heat and waited for sensation to return. When it did, it came with pain, the particular burning ache of blood moving back into cold tissue, and she made no sound but sat very still through it, because the pain meant the hands were recovering, and the hands were what everything else depended on. When she could feel her fingers reliably, she began to work. She opened the 3 sealed jars. The first held dried camas, bulbs, and pine nuts. The top layer smelled questionable, but the center was dry and sound. The second held hard serviceberry cakes, dense and untouched by mold. The third, sealed with a plug of old beeswax, held dried willow bark, yarrow bundles, and sage. She found a piece of wrapped pemmican wedged behind the shelf support, cut away the spoiled edges with a rusted knife, tasted a small piece from the center, and set the rest aside to confirm it would not make her sick before eating more. Then she took a fragment of charcoal from the edge of the hearth and turned to the wall. She drew the first column: food, fuel, dry materials, salvageable materials, repairs needed. She worked through the inventory with the same systematic attention she had brought to Coldridge's supply ledgers for 4 years, noting quantities, assessing condition, estimating duration under different consumption rates. The numbers were not encouraging. At best, the food she had found would last 12 to 15 days if rationed with a discipline that the word careful did not quite capture. But the numbers existed. She had counted them. They were hers to work with. Before she allowed herself to sleep, she moved the tinderbox to the highest available shelf. Things stored low belonged to moisture first. She arranged the dry hides as a sleeping surface, putting them between her body and the cold stone floor. She placed 2 heated stones from the hearth's edge inside the hide bundle to hold warmth through the night. Then she lay down and looked at the charcoal marks on the wall and listened to the waterfall's vibration move through the stone all around her. For 4 years, the numbers she kept had belonged to Harlan Drum's ledger. They tracked what he owned and what she owed, and the distance between those 2 figures, which was always precisely large enough to keep her in place. These numbers were different. These numbers tracked what she had, and what she needed, and what the next day required. They belonged to no one but her. They pointed not toward debt, but toward tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, and the winter beyond that which would arrive, whether she was ready for it or not. She was going to be ready for it. Outside, the rain had turned to snow. The falling water at the falls became slightly muffled, slightly softened as snowflakes began absorbing some of its sound. The temperature was dropping. The mountain was making itself ready for the season ahead. Ada Voss closed her eyes. She had 1 wool blanket still slightly damp. She had a fire drawing cleanly for now. She had food for 12 days if she was careful. She had a knife. She had her hands. She had the arithmetic. She had been given nothing and expected to die in it. She was going to build something instead. The smoke was the first enemy. Ada had built the fire larger on the second morning because the temperature had dropped further, and the chamber walls were conducting cold in from the mountain around them, and because she had found 2 additional pieces of sound wood tucked deep beneath the storage shelf where moisture had never reached. She fed the fire deliberately, and for the first several minutes it burned well. Then the smoke dropped. It came down from the ceiling in a slow gray curtain rolling across the upper chamber like something deliberate, and within 2 minutes, the air near the hearth was thick enough to make her eyes water. She smothered the fire with damp soil scraped from the passage floor, pressed her face close to the ground where the air was still clean and breathed. She did not panic. Panic was a form of waste, and she could not afford waste. She lay on the chamber floor with her cheek against the cold stone, and breathed slowly, and thought about the problem the way she thought about a supply ledger that did not balance, not with frustration, but with the focused attention of someone looking for the entry that does not belong. The fire was not the problem. The fire had burned correctly. The problem was the air. She waited until the smoke cleared enough to move, then took a loose strand of wool, pulled from the fraying edge of her blanket, and held it near the ceiling at different points across the chamber. The wool hung limp in most places. Near the back wall it moved. Barely a slight tremor, rather than a genuine current, but it moved. She followed the movement to its source. Behind the rearmost storage shelf, where the stone wall angled slightly before meeting the ceiling, a narrow passage led upward. She had seen it the first night, and noted it without yet understanding its purpose. Now she understood. It was a vent passage deliberately placed positioned to draw air up and out of the chamber when the fire created the right differential. But something had blocked it. She could feel the compression of stale air at the opening, the way it pushed back slightly against her hand rather than drawing inward. She took the longest branch from the firewood pile, a dried sapling she had not yet broken for burning, and worked it upward into the passage. Resistance after the first few feet. She pushed carefully, rotating the branch, feeling the blockage give in stages first, something soft. A bird nest, judging by the texture of debris that fell back past her hands. Then compacted pine needles and root material accumulated over years of the passage sitting unused. It took most of the morning. Her shoulders ached from working overhead in the confined space. Twice, she nearly lost her footing on the uneven chamber floor. When she finally felt the branch move freely upward with no further resistance, she pulled it back and stood still for a moment in the near dark, listening. A faint sound reached her from above. Not wind exactly, but the presence of outside air. The suggestion of the mountain breathing through the passage the way it had been designed to breathe. She rebuilt the fire. Small first. She burned a bundle of dry bark beneath the vent opening before adding wood to the main hearth, warming the air column in the passage to encourage the draft to establish itself before she asked it to do real work. She watched the wool strand near the ceiling. It lifted, steadied, drew toward the back wall. She added wood. The smoke rose and kept rising. The chamber cleared. The fire burned. Ada sat back on her heels and looked at the flame. Then she picked up the charcoal stub and added an entry to the wall. Day 2. Vent passage cleared. Draft established. System modified and functioning. She had learned something. She wrote it down. This was how the numbers worked. Over the following 4 days, she turned the damaged cache into something that could sustain a person through the winter. She did not try to heat the entire chamber. Instead, she built a smaller world inside the larger one. Using willow branches from a stand she had found 30 yards below the falls on the second afternoon, she constructed a low sleeping enclosure on the highest and driest section of the chamber floor. 2 of the salvageable hides became the walls lashed to the willow frame with strips of rawhide cut from a longer piece found bundled beneath the collapsed shelf. A 3rd hide trimmed to remove mold damage along one edge became an outer layer hung slightly apart from the inner walls with airspace between them. The air gap held warmth better than doubled material would have because still air was itself an insulator. She dug a shallow drainage trench along the south wall to carry moisture away from the sleeping area when the stone wept condensation in temperature shifts. She raised the remaining storage shelves on salvaged wood supports. She moved the ruined materials to the entrance passage where they could dry in the marginal warmer air that moved through during the middle of the day. Not every solution worked. One hide she hung too close to the stone wall came back wet. The following morning, the outer surface cold and heavy with condensation the rock was generating. She rebuilt the attachment, pulling the hide 6 inches from the wall, and the problem resolved. A storage shelf collapsed under the weight of a clay crock. The crock survived. She replaced the shelf with a lighter frame of sinew-lashed willow and tested it with increasing weight before trusting it with the food stores. For heat through the night, she developed a system with river stones gathered from below the falls during the warmer part of the afternoon. She heated 4 stones beside Never in the fire, letting them absorb heat slowly over several hours. Wrapped in hide scraps, they went beneath her bedding before she slept, and she rotated them every 3 hours, moving the coolest ones back beside the fire and returning the newly heated ones to the sleeping enclosure. It was interrupted sleep. It was warm sleep. On the 7th night, the thermometer read 18 degrees outside. Inside the sleeping enclosure, 52. 1 bundle of wood. Smoke clean. Hides dry. Hides. She wrote the numbers on the wall and lay back on the hide bedding and looked at the stone ceiling. Outside ice teeth had begun forming along the cliff face around Ravenfall, extending downward from the overhang in pale formations that grew visibly between dawn and dusk. The falls themselves were narrowing as the cold captured the water at the edges, leaving a dark central column still running full and loud. Inside the system held. It was not finished. Warmth was one problem. Food was another, and it was rapidly becoming the more pressing one. The camas and pine nuts could stretch perhaps 10 more days with strict rationing, the service berry cakes another 4 or 5. The salvaged pemmican was nearly gone. She turned her attention to the deer hide map. She had been studying it since the first night, returning to it in the intervals between tasks, holding it near the fire and tracing the markings with her fingertip. It was not a language she could read the way she read ledger entries or freight manifests. The symbols did not correspond to any alphabet or notation system she had been taught. But patterns emerged with sustained attention the way patterns always did. And after 7 days, she had begun to understand something about what the map actually was. It was not the work of one person. Different hands had made different marks. She could see that in the variation of line weight and symbol style. Some of the markings were older, the hide itself darkened around those symbols from years of handling and firelight. Others were newer, added in a different shorthand that looked like the work of someone who had come to this place later and contributed their own understanding to the record they found. People had been learning this mountain for a long time before Ada Voss arrived behind a waterfall with half a loaf of barley bread and a rusted knife. She was not alone in this place, and even now, even with the mountains sealed in snow outside and no other human voice within miles. She was in a conversation that had been going on for decades, perhaps longer, and she was being given the chance to add her part to it. She traced the symbols one by one and tested each against the terrain she explored in the margin of daylight available each afternoon. A wavy line near a circle led her through a low passage at the base of the chamber's east wall to a spring that emerged from a crack in the rock. The water was cold enough to hurt her hands, but it moved freely, which meant it would not freeze, which meant she had water through the winter, regardless of what the snow did to the surface streams. 3 short marks beneath a slope symbol led her to a hillside 50 yards south of the falls, where the wind had swept most of the snow away, leaving a section of ground exposed. She found a willow thicket at the base of the slope that showed signs she recognized without being able to immediately name. And then she understood. The crossing patterns in the snow around the willow stems, the small compressed ovals at the base of several branches, the way certain stems were stripped of bark in a band approximately 18 inches from the ground, snowshoe hairs. She repaired the damaged snare mechanism found in the old tin box, a piece of spring steel that had survived in usable condition, and built 2 additional snares from rawhide and sinew, working slowly, because the cold made fine manipulation difficult. She set all 3 in the willow thicket before nightfall, positioning the loops at the height the sign suggested. The next morning, all 3 were empty. The second morning, one had been triggered and the bait taken. The loop had never closed. She crouched beside it and studied the failure, the angle of the loop, the placement relative to the track pattern, and she rebuilt it. The loop needed to hang in a gap that offered the animal no route except through it. She had placed it where a hare might pass. She needed to place it where a hare had no other choice. She moved all 3 snares into the narrowest gaps in the willow stand, places where the stems grew so close together that a moving animal would have only one practical line through. She adjusted the loop heights based on the compressed oval shapes she had been observing. On the 3rd morning, a snowshoe hare waited in the 3rd snare. Ada felt the particular relief of a calculation that resolves the satisfaction of a figure that finally balances. Not triumph. Simply correct. She processed the animal with complete attention. The meat was set aside in the cold alcove near the chamber entrance where the temperature would preserve it for several days. The hide was scraped and stretched on a willow frame. The sinew was separated and added to her supply. The bones were set aside, the leg bones in particular, which were strong and hollow and could be worked into needles or awls with the right tools and enough patience. Even the small amount of fat she could render was useful, feeding the lamp she had assembled from a cracked crock and a twist of hide wick. Nothing was wasted. Everything taken from the mountain was honored by being fully used. She set one of the bones beside the hearth and looked at it for a moment. In Coldridge, she had been accused of taking what did not belong to her. Here she was learning what it actually meant to take something honestly, to know exactly what she was taking and why, and to use every part of it with the respect owed to something that had cost another living creature everything. She added an entry to the wall. Day 10. Snare system operational. First hare. Full use, no waste. While Ada learned what the mountain had to teach, Coldridge Camp was having a different kind of education. She could not know this then. She knew only the accumulation of days on the wall. But Corder Gant had not left when the roads reopened, because the roads had not reopened. The early snow that came in on the night Ada left the camp had been followed by a second heavier fall 3 days later, and the logging road south was buried under drifts that made travel impossible. Corder Gant was stranded at Coldridge Camp with his recovered payroll box and the particular uncomfortable freedom of a man who has nowhere to be, and therefore has time to think. He had been thinking. He was good with numbers himself in the practical way of a man who managed payroll. 32 workers and could not afford mistakes. And the numbers he was encountering and the margin of time his stranding had given him were not resolving correctly. The amount recorded in Harlan's ledger as missing from the camp's general fund was not matching the amount that had actually been in the box. The discrepancy was not large, but it was consistent, and when he cross-referenced the camp's supply pricing before and after the incident, he found that flour, salt, lamp oil, and 3 other staple goods had all risen in price in the week following Ada's expulsion. The camp was paying for the theft through higher supply prices. Harlan was covering the shortfall and generating a return on it. Corder sat with this information for several days, not quite knowing what to do with it. He was not a man who acted without adequate evidence, and what he had was suggestive rather than conclusive. He kept looking at the numbers. He kept finding the same answer. Meanwhile, Ezra Cord had returned from the northern trap line. Ezra was 61 years old, lean and weathered in the way of men who had spent more of their adult lives outdoors than in with a tracker's habit of observing everything and commenting on very little. He had been running a line of traps in the high country since mid-September and had come back to Coldridge for resupply with the unhurried manner of a man who considers the surrounding mountains his actual home and the camp merely a convenient annex. He reported what he had seen on his way south. A thin ribbon of smoke rising from the cliff face above Raven Fall. Not steam, he was specific about this distinction because steam from a warm spring moved differently than combustion smoke, and he had been watching both for 40 years. Combustion smoke. Clean meaning dry wood and a functional draft, rising from a position on the cliff where, as far as he knew, there was nothing but rock. The mess hall went quiet when he said it. Harlan called it steam without hesitation. A warm seep and underground vent, a natural phenomenon. Nothing more. Preston spoke almost before Harlan finished. His voice was controlled but moved too fast, covered too much ground, too quickly. Not the pace of a man contributing information, but of a man eliminating possibilities. Someone should verify this before the weather worsened. He was thinking of the camp's interests, of ensuring there were no complications. He was thinking of nothing of the kind. Stellan Marsh had been sitting near the window at the end of the mess hall bench, and he looked at Preston the way a man looks at a text that is not saying what it claims to be saying. Preston was not worried that Ada might be suffering. He was worried that Ada might be alive and coherent and capable of eventually speaking to someone with the authority to listen. That was a different kind of worry, and it produced a different kind of behavior, and Stellan had spent enough time in small closed communities to know the difference. Harlan organized a search party for the following morning. He asked Ezra to guide them to the position where he had seen the smoke. Ezra said no. He said it simply without elaboration, in the flat declarative tone of a man who has assessed a situation and reached a conclusion he is not interested in debating. Early winter ice on the approaches to Raven Fall could kill 3 men before they reached the rock face. He had seen it happen. He was not going to be the person responsible for taking Harlan Drum's men up that cliff in these conditions. The refusal cost him. By the end of the day, his credit at the camp's company store, the only place within a 20-mile radius where a man running a mountain trap line could purchase salt powder and other necessaries, had been suspended. Harlan presented this as a straightforward matter of account management. Ezra had failed to fulfill a reasonable request. His credit arrangement reflected his standing with the camp's primary tenant. It was punishment. Ezra accepted it without visible reaction. He spent 3 days resupplying what he could from his own trail cache, then went back up the mountain alone, by the eastern ridge where the wind had cleared most of the accumulated snow. He moved with the patient efficiency of someone for whom difficult terrain had long since become unconscious habit. Ada saw him before he saw her. She was on the ledge above the falls, checking the ice formation around the chamber entrance when she caught movement on the eastern ridge 200 yards out. She watched him approach without moving. The restored trapper's knife was in her hand, not raised, not ready for anything specific, simply present the way a tool should be when you are in uncertain territory. He was 60 yards out when he stopped. He placed a small bundle on the snow at that distance and stepped back from it. Then he turned and began walking away. Ada came down from the ledge. She crossed to the bundle and crouched over it without yet picking it up. Salt wrapped in canvas. 2 pieces of iron wire, heavy gauge, suitable for stronger snares. A scrap of waterproofed canvas roughly 3 feet square. She picked up the canvas and stood. Ezra had stopped walking. He turned back. They looked at each other across 60 yards of snow. He covered the distance between them at the unhurried pace he moved at everywhere, and when he reached her, he did not speak first. He looked at the cliff face. He looked at the barely visible line of the chamber entrance behind the curtain of falling water. He looked at the willow frames stretched with hare hides. He looked at the even stacks of firewood near the lower entrance passage, sorted by thickness, protected by a windbreak she had assembled from flat stones. He was looking at work, not luck. Work accumulated over days, methodical and considered. Then he looked at the deer-hide map she had brought out to study in the daylight, and something shifted in his expression, a recognition, though he did not speak it immediately. He touched one corner of the map, traced a symbol with one rough finger without quite making contact with the surface. Then he looked at her. "Shoshone camp markers," he said. "Winter travel notation. I have seen this system before, long time ago." He did not ask how she had found the map or what she had made of it. He looked at the entries she had chalked on the flat stone near the entrance temperature records. Dates, inventory, figures, and he read them the way he would read track sign, absorbing information without passing judgment on it. When he spoke again, it was practical. Preston Drum was coming. Not today, probably not tomorrow, but soon. Harlan could not afford to let the question of Ada's survival remain unresolved much longer. Every day she might be alive was a day someone might find her, and finding her meant hearing her, and hearing her made the conversation at camp more complicated than Harlan wanted. Preston had been pushing for a search party since Ezra's refusal. He was going to find someone willing to attempt the climb. The air pressure was falling. Birds were sitting low in the timber. The wind had begun rotating from north to northeast, which in this part of Idaho Territory, in November, meant one thing: a major storm was coming. Not the early snow that had fallen over the past weeks, something larger. Ada did not ask him to confirm this. She looked at what she had and did the calculation. She had 3 days, perhaps 4, to prepare for a storm of serious duration. She had food for approximately 9 more days on current rationing. She had a functional heating system tested against 18 below zero. She had a vent passage that required active maintenance in icing conditions. She had one weak point, the lower entrance, which she had identified on the map, but not yet fully prepared for heavy drifting. She had work to do. Ezra told her one more thing before he left. There was a second entrance to the cave system. The map markings and the airflow patterns suggested it. A lower passage accessed through the willow stand along the talus field to the southeast. The double line marking on the map that she had found without yet understanding an alternative route in and out, one that Harlan's men would not know to look for because it was not visible from the cliff face. He walked back up the eastern ridge the way he had come. Ada stood in the snow and watched him go. Then she turned and began preparing for what was coming. She found the lower entrance where Ezra had suggested a gap in the talus at the base of the willow stand, low to the ground, accessible only if you knew where to look and were willing to go in at ground level. She explored inward with a small torch until she confirmed the passage connected to the main chamber system, entering through a low shelf at the far end of the sleeping enclosure. Then she prepared it. A willow and bark windbreak outside the entrance, built low and angled to direct wind away from the opening rather than into it. A canvas baffle hung 20 inches inside, creating a dead air space that would slow cold transfer. A second rawhide curtain behind that, with a gap between the 2 layers. A long pole laid beside the entrance for breaking ice accumulation in the freeze-thaw cycles that would occur every time temperature shifted. She divided her tinder supply into 3 separate containers and stored them in 3 different locations. Half the remaining firewood went deeper into the chamber, away from the hearth and into the dry interior. Preston came on the 14th day. She heard them long before she saw anything: the sound of metal on stone moving through the passages and amplified by the rock. He had brought 2 men from the camp, both loggers, and they carried a rifle, a pry bar, and a coil of rope. The stated purpose was recovery of stolen funds, which Preston had suggested Ada might have cached somewhere in the mountains. This was not the actual purpose. Ada moved fast. Food thermometer, map knife, tinderbox, and most of her bedding. Everything critical went through the lower passage into the deeper section of the chamber system within 20 minutes. Then she turned to the main entrance passage. Using loose stone and a forked branch as a lever, she built a barrier across the main passage from the inside. She did not seal it completely. A small gap at the floor level preserved the airflow the heating system depended on. The barrier was constructed from stones that had been there long enough to develop the same weathered color as the surrounding rock. From the outside, it looked like a natural collapse. She retreated through the lower passage, closed the inner curtain behind her, and waited in the dark. She heard Preston reach the falls. She heard poor footing on the ice, one man going down hard and cursing a long argument about the stability of the route. Preston pushed on. The other 2 did not. She heard Preston find the crack behind the waterfall. She heard him move along the face, probing, looking for an opening that the natural collapse had erased. She heard him stop. She heard his breathing in the pause that followed, and then his voice aimed into the darkness of what appeared to be a sealed passage. He said that no one from Coldridge Camp would come looking for her once the storm arrived. He said these things in the tone of a man concluding a task, closing an account, moving on. He believed he was letting winter finish what he had started, but he knew nothing about the lower passage. He did not know about the spring, the vent, or the winter route marked on the deer hide. He did not know about the snare line in the willow thicket, or the temperature records on the wall, or the system that had held at 52 degrees through an 18 below night on one bundle of firewood. He had seen a crack in a cliff and concluded there was nothing behind it. From behind her barrier, Ada pressed her ear to the small gap at the floor and listened to his footsteps recede. She stayed still until the sound was gone and only the falls remained. Then she reached one hand through the gap and felt the air moving against her palm. The passage was still breathing. The storm came 3 nights later. It did not build. It arrived a wall of wind from the northeast that hit the cliff face with a sound like structural failure, driving the temperature from 11 below to 22 below in the span of a few hours, and depositing snow so fast that the drifts at the lower entrance had to be cleared every 3 hours to keep the passage open. She had run the test the evening before the storm. Outside temperature 6 degrees. Sleeping enclosure 52 degrees. Draft weak but holding. Tinder dry. Less than 1 full bundle of wood. She had added the entry to the wall with the particular care she brought to all the entries now, not because the numbers were remarkable, but because the discipline of recording them was itself a form of control. She controlled what she measured. She measured what mattered. What was measured could be managed. At Coldridge Camp, the storm was a different experience. She could only imagine it then, lying in her sleeping enclosure, while the wind made the cliff face above groan with a sound she felt more than heard. She imagined the mess hall crowded with families, the wood stove burning too hot because cold people piled on wood without thinking about the chimney. She imagined the horse barn roof under the weight of the accumulation. She imagined Harlan's stovepipe glowing red-orange in the dark. She checked her remaining supply. 3 bundles, plus the reserved cash deeper in the chamber. 3 bundles was sufficient for 4 more nights at her current consumption rate. She was not cold. She checked the vent. She broke ice from the lower entrance with the long pole. She rotated the heated stones. She ate a careful portion from the food stores and replaced the jar on its shelf. On the 5th day of the blizzard, she heard something from the lower passage, something different from wind or ice or settling stone. A sound from outside the entrance carried in along the tunnel, irregular, slow. The sound of something moving that was having great difficulty moving. She took the torch and went through the lower passage and pushed through the outer curtain and looked into the storm. Stellan Marsh was approximately 15 feet from the entrance. He was on his hands and knees in the snow, which told her everything about his condition. He had stopped moving forward. He was using his arms to hold himself above the surface, but making no progress. His face, what she could see of it in the torch's guttering light, was the particular pale blue-gray that meant he was past shivering and into the dangerous stillness beyond it. She went to him. She got her shoulder under his arm and brought him to his feet. He was heavier than she expected, or she was more tired than she had realized, and she moved him through the entrance and through the inner curtain and into the warmth of the lower chamber. She laid him on the driest section of floor and covered him with hides. She did not place him near the fire. She had thought about this before in the abstract, the way she thought about all the practical problems. The mountain presented. The danger of rewarming too fast, the way cold contracted tissue responded to sudden heat. And she applied the conclusion she had reached without hesitation. Warm water, small amounts, not hot. She had the clay crock positioned over the coals within minutes, water from the spring heating slowly, and she brought it to him in the tin cup she had carried from Coldridge, offering it in sips rather than letting him drink freely. His hands took 40 minutes to begin responding. His color took longer. For the first 3 hours, he spoke very little. He looked at the charcoal entries on the wall. He looked at the elevated storage shelves, the rawhide curtains at the entrance, the snare-cleaned hair bones drying near the warm section of the wall. He looked at the sleeping enclosure with its layered hides and the air gap built into its construction. He was looking at something that had been built. After the 3rd hour, when the color had come back to his face and his hands were moving with something approaching coordination, he sat up and looked at the temperature entry on the wall from that morning. Outside, 22 below. Sleeping enclosure, 51. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "How long have you been here?" 18 days, she said. He was quiet again. He looked at the entries, all 18 of them each with its temperature readings, fuel consumption inventory notes. Its record of what had been done and how. Ada brought the food stores for the evening, a careful portion of dried camas, a piece of hare, meat rationed over 3 days, a few pine nuts. She divided it into 2 portions. She gave Stellan the clay bowl. It was the only intact vessel remaining. The others had cracked or broken in the weeks since she arrived, each one repurposed into something useful, but only one whole bowl left. She ate her own portion from the largest fragment of the bowl she had broken on the 18th day, when she had slipped on the ice near the hearth and the bowl had hit the stone floor and come apart. Stellan looked at the fragment in her hand. He looked at the whole bowl in his. He understood without a word being said the full weight of what he was holding, not just the bowl, but the 18 days it represented, the care with which every object in this place had been used and maintained and mourned, when lost and repurposed when mourning was finished. He sat with it quietly, in the warmth she had made from what the mountain had kept. Outside, the storm continued its work. Inside, the numbers on the wall kept their quiet record of everything she had done and how it had held. Stellan Marsh spent 3 days in the chamber behind Ravenfall. By the second morning, he was sitting upright. By the third, he was asking questions not about his own condition, but about the night the payroll box disappeared, about the spare key, about the lock that showed no damage, about the boot prints in the mud outside the office that Harlan had declined to measure. He asked in the methodical way of a man assembling a case rather than satisfying curiosity, and Ada answered each question in the order it arrived, without embellishment and without omission. She told him about the 2 times she had seen Preston slip into the storehouse after hours. She told him about the spare key in the desk drawer, how she had seen Preston access that drawer before, always in the early evening, always when Harlan was occupied elsewhere. She told him about the 3 questions she had asked in the mess hall and the 3 ways Harlan had chosen not to answer them. She told him about the script found in her sewing kit, the placement of it between 2 folded squares of cotton batting, positioned to be found efficiently rather than discovered accidentally. A guilty person hiding evidence put it somewhere difficult to find. A person framing someone else put it somewhere easy. Stellan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The scratches on his left hand," he said. "I saw them the morning of the search, fresh abrasions parallel from rough wood." "The weighing shed floor," Ada said. "The boards are old pine unfinished. If you were prying against them in the dark with both hands, you would come up with exactly that pattern." Stellan nodded. "And Harlan's ledger, the supply prices. You saw him change the entries, the afternoon of the day you left. I did not understand what I was seeing at the time. I thought it was a correction." He reached inside his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. He had been writing during the week since Ada's expulsion, small observations recorded because the habit of a teacher was to write things down. He had noted the prices before and after. He had calculated the discrepancy in Harlan's loss figures against the actual contents of the payroll box. He had written down in precise language what he had observed about Preston's behavior on the morning of the accusation. He had not known until he arrived here half dead in a blizzard what to do with any of it. He knew now. Ada prepared what he would carry back to Coldridge with the same methodical attention she brought to every task in the chamber. She copied the temperature records from the wall onto a flat piece of mica, pressing charcoal into the stone's surface with deliberate strokes. She wrote out on a second piece the full account of the night the box disappeared. Everything she knew, everything she had observed, everything she had concluded in chronological order. Each point numbered each piece of evidence, separated from her interpretation of it so that a reader could follow her reasoning and verify it independently. She included a third document, a calculation. She had known the supply prices at Coldridge for 4 years, working from memory, which was reliable. Because she had been keeping these figures for years, she constructed a table showing the price adjustments Harlan had made following her expulsion. She calculated the difference between what the camp residents were paying and what they would have paid at the previous rates. She ran the total across the full winter projection. The camp was being overcharged by more than the payroll box had ever contained. Harlan Drum had not merely tolerated his son's theft. He had used it. He had used Ada's expulsion and the story of the stolen payroll as justification for price increases that recovered the loss and exceeded it, charging the difference to the 42 people who lived and worked inside his fences and had no other place to buy supplies within 20 miles. She gave Stellan the documents and the long pole she kept beside the entrance for clearing ice. He looked at the pole. "What will you use?" "I made another one," she said. 3 days ago." He understood from this that she had been anticipating his departure and preparing for it before he had thought to ask the question. Before he left, he looked at her steadily. "Do you want me to tell them what you built here?" Ada considered the question with the same care she brought to the temperature readings. "Tell them what happened," she said. "In the order it happened, let the sequence speak." He left through the lower passage in the early morning of the 22nd day when the storm had dropped enough to make the Eastern Ridge route passable. Ada watched the curtain fall back into place behind him and then turned to the wall and added the entry for the day. Temperature, fuel, inventory, what had been done, what remained to be done. The work continued. She checked the snare line in the willow thicket. She rebuilt the lower entrance windbreak where the storm had shifted 2 of the flat stones out of alignment. She checked the vent passage, found it clear, recorded this. She added wood to the fire and watched the smoke rise and turned away, satisfied. It was on the 24th day that the weighing shed roof failed. She did not know this immediately. She knew it 3 days later when Stellan came back through the lower passage in the early afternoon, moving with the energy of a man carrying news rather than the careful energy of a man conserving warmth, and told her what had been found. The storm's sustained wind load had finally exceeded what the old shed's compromised structure could manage. A rafter had gone first, pulling the ridge beam with it, and the collapse had transferred force down through the wall, framing into the floor joists. One of the floor joists had twisted. A floorboard near the north wall had lifted. Corder Gant had been in the shed with Ezra Cord and 3 camp workers looking for salvageable tar paper to repair cabin roofing the storm had damaged. They were not looking for the payroll box. They found it anyway. The walnut box sat in the hollow beneath the lifted board, exactly where Preston had placed it 7 weeks earlier. The brass lock was intact. The pry marks on the lid's edge were visible and consistent with the broken section of pry tool found beside the box. A tool that had shed splinters of walnut wood into its own breakpoint, matching the wood of the box's corner, where the tool had slipped during the original forced entry. The spare office key was there. 2 gambling debt notes in Preston's handwriting made out to the 2 teamsters, never delivered because the silver coin had served their purpose instead. A fragment of coat fabric caught on a nail head at the board's edge, torn from a left sleeve at a height consistent with a man crouching over the hiding place. Corder picked up the box and held it for a moment without speaking. Then he carried it to the mess hall. He set it on the long table at the north end of the room. The same table where 7 weeks earlier Harlan Drum had stood and read a labor contract aloud before tearing it in half. The same table where the debt ledger had remained untouched while Ada walked out into the snow. Corder set the payroll box in the center of that table and stepped back. And people began coming in from the yard and the bunkhouses and the kitchen, drawn by the wordless signal that moves through a small, closed community when something has shifted. Harlan came in from his office. He saw the box. He saw Corder's face. He saw Stellan Marsh standing near the east wall with a collection of papers in his hand. He looked at all of it for a moment and then constructed his last defense with the efficiency of a man who has spent 15 years building systems that required defending. He said it was possible that Ada and Preston had worked together, that the evidence against Preston did not preclude Ada's involvement, that the camp had acted on the best available information, and the moral responsibility for the outcome lay with the person who had created the false circumstances, not the people who had responded to them in good faith. It was a reasonable argument. It was the kind of argument that worked in rooms where people were uncertain and the person making it held authority. This room was not that room anymore. Ezra Cord set something on the table beside the payroll box. It was the spare office key, the one found beneath the floorboard in the weighing shed alongside Preston's debt notes. He had carried it since the morning of the discovery without quite knowing when the right moment would arrive. The moment had arrived. Corder looked at it. He looked at Harlan. "You told the camp that key was in the drawer all morning," he said. "You checked it yourself. Those were your words." He paused. "Then how did it end up under the shed floor?" The room did not require an answer. The question was the answer. The two teamsters were still at Coldridge. The roads had remained impassable through the storm, and they spoke next. They confirmed in plain language and without prompting that Preston Drum had paid his card debt to them using silver coin before dawn on the morning after the payroll box was reported missing. The coin was of the same denomination and mint date as the coin in the box. They had thought nothing of it at the time. They thought a great deal of it now. Corder Gant opened Stellan's documentation next and read the supply price figures aloud, the figures before Ada's expulsion and the figures after the calculated difference, the total overcharge projected across the winter season. He read them in the flat, careful voice of a man who works with numbers professionally and understands that numbers properly presented do not require emotional emphasis. They make their own argument. The room was very still. Bethel Webb rose from the bench near the east wall. She had been sitting there since the beginning with the coat folded across her lap, the coat she had tried to give Ada on the morning of the expulsion and been prevented from giving. She rose without hurry and stood with the coat still folded over her forearm. She asked 3 questions, Bethel said. He refused to answer all 3. No elaboration, no raised voice, just the fact placed in the room like a stone set on a scale. Harlan opened his mouth. He did not speak. Then Corder Gant did something no one had expected, including himself. He set the papers down on the table and straightened and looked across the room at the space where Ada was not standing, the space in the center of the mess hall floor, where she had stood 7 weeks ago with 42 people looking at the floor rather than at her. And he spoke in the quiet, deliberate voice of a man who has decided that accuracy matters more than comfort. "I was not deceived," he said. "She asked the right question about that key, and I heard it, and I set it aside, because following it would have required more of me than I was willing to give at the time. I chose the easier answer. That is my accounting of it, and I'm not going to dress it differently than that." The room absorbed this. It was not an apology in the formal sense. It asked for nothing, and offered nothing except the truth plainly stated with no attempt to manage how it landed. For a man who had built his professional life on accurate assessments, it was the only statement available to him that did not compound the original error with a second one. Nobody argued with him. Harlan left the mess hall without speaking again. He walked through the camp yard with the particular gait of a man whose legs are still moving but whose direction has been taken from him. He went into his office and closed the door, and sat there while the camp around him began the conversation he had spent 15 years ensuring would never happen. People comparing contract terms, comparing debt figures, comparing the supply prices they remembered from September against the ones they had been paying since November. The mathematics of what Harlan had built were not complicated once people began looking at them together. They had been complicated only because each person had been looking alone. Preston Drum took the camp's best remaining horse before dawn on the morning after the box was discovered. He had understood from Harlan's expression the previous evening that the conversation was moving toward a conclusion that required distance. He left the camp on the eastern road, heading south, moving with the urgency of a man who has spent his life running from consequences and has finally run out of places to run to before he knows it. Sheriff Dolan Hess arrived at Coldridge 2 days later when the roads had opened enough for a horse and rider to move south from the county seat. He was a compact, deliberate man in his late 50s who listened considerably more than he talked and had been in the territory long enough to understand how camps like Coldridge operated and what kind of pressure shaped the behavior of people inside them. He had already received the telegraph message Stellan had sent from the station at the base of the hollow when the lines reopened after the storm. He had already sent a deputy south. Preston was intercepted at the bridge crossing 2 days' ride from Coldridge on a tired horse by a deputy who had been waiting with the patience of a man given a clear description of both the rider and the animal, and told to wait until they appeared. In the saddlebag behind the cantle, 2 additional Silver Run payroll vouchers that Preston had removed from the box on the original night, intending to use them later through intermediaries in a town where Silver Run's name carried less weight. He was arrested without incident and transported back to the county seat in the custody of the territorial marshal's office, which had developed its own interest in the matter once Stellan's documentation reached the right desk. Sheriff Hess spent an afternoon at Coldridge examining everything the box. The key, the debt notes, the pry tool and its embedded walnut splinters, the coat fragment. Stellan's written observations. Corder's price analysis. Then he asked to see the labor contract ledger. He found 6 contracts that shared the same structural feature compound interest and fee provisions that prevented the principal debt from decreasing regardless of how consistently the worker made payments. Not illegal by the letter of territorial law as it currently stood, but sufficient combined with the documented evidence of deliberate fraud and the calculated price manipulation to constitute a pattern the territorial marshal's office would find worth examining at length. Harlan Drum did not attempt to leave. He cooperated with the inquiry with the resigned thoroughness of a man who understands that delay will only worsen the final figure. He lost the camp. Not immediately and not entirely cleanly, the territorial legal process moved at the pace these processes always moved. But the fraudulent labor contracts were voided. The supply price overcharges were assessed as a debt against the camp's operating account. The criminal charges associated with his deliberate suppression of the evidence Ada had presented in the mess hall and his use of the incident to justify the price manipulation were sufficient to remove his operating license for a period that made reopening impractical. The camp changed hands within a season operated under different terms by people with different assumptions about what a labor contract was supposed to accomplish. 3 days after Preston's arrest, Harlan came to Ravenfall. He did not come alone. He brought Stellan Marsh, Corder Gant, and Sheriff Hess. He did not bring a rifle or the debt ledger. He came through the lower passage, ducking under the entrance frame, moving through the willow baffle and the canvas curtain, and into the lower chamber with a particular careful movement of a large man in a small space that is not built for him. Ada was sitting beside the hearth, mending a length of rawhide strap. She did not stand when they entered. The fire burned at its usual careful level. The temperature entries on the wall were visible in the firelight, 27 days of them now neat and consistent, each one a record of what had been managed and how. Sheriff Hess spoke first. He outlined the situation in the plain factual manner he used for everything: the evidence recovered from the weighing shed, the arrests, the legal proceedings underway, the status of the labor contracts, and the voiding of the debt Harlan had claimed Ada still owed. The proper accounting, when examined, revealed that the camp owed her 4 years of ledger work, performed above the terms of the original contract, calculated at the rate a similarly qualified person would have received for equivalent work in the territory. It was a considerable sum. Corder Gant confirmed the figures from the price analysis. He did not repeat what he had said in the mess hall. He had said it once, and that was enough. But he stood in the chamber that Ada had built and looked at the wall of numbered entries and kept his expression steady in the way of a man who is sitting with something uncomfortable and has decided he deserves to sit with it. Harlan cleared his throat. He said that he had acted on the evidence available to him at the time. He said it the way a man says something he has rehearsed, knowing it is inadequate, saying it anyway because the alternative is silence, and silence in this situation felt worse. He said he had not known the full extent of what Preston had done. Ada set down the rawhide strap. She looked at him across the hearth. "You refuse to check the lock," she said. "You refuse to measure the boot prints. You refuse to account for the spare key. Those were not failures of information. The information was available. You had it in front of you. You chose not to use it." The chamber was very quiet. The fire made its small sounds. The waterfall's vibration moved through the stone around them as it always did, constant and indifferent to everything human. "That is not a mistake made in good faith," she said. "That is a decision made in convenience. There is a difference, and I think you have always known the difference." Harlan did not answer. There was nothing to answer with. The arguments he had spent 15 years building about evidence and judgment and the responsibilities of a man in his position had collapsed in the same way the weighing shed roof had collapsed under accumulated weight they were never actually designed to bear. After a long moment he stood. He moved toward the lower passage entrance. The rawhide curtain Ada had built and secured to the upper frame of the passage opening hung at the height she needed it to hang, which was not the height that accommodated a tall man walking upright. He had to duck his head to pass beneath it, this man who had spent 15 years deciding what people were worth and where they belonged and what they were permitted to do. bowing his head to exit a place built entirely by the person he had sent into the winter with a blanket and half a loaf of bread, and the expectation that the cold would settle the matter cleanly. He did not look back. His footsteps moved through the passage and faded, and then there was only the sound of the falls. Corder paused near the wall on his way out. He looked at the entries for a moment, all 27 days of them, with the expression of a man reading a document he should have been given weeks ago. He did not speak. He nodded once to Ada and followed Harlan through the curtain. Sheriff Hess paused at the entrance. "The territory will need a statement from you when you are ready," he said. "There is no particular urgency on our end. The material evidence has been sufficient." "I know where the county seat is," Ada said. He left. Stellan was last. He stood near the hearth and looked at the temperature entry from that morning outside, temperature 11 degrees. Sleeping enclosure, 49 2/3 of a bundle, and then he looked at her. "What do you need?" he asked. It was the right question, not what are you going to do, not where will you go. What do you need? She considered it with the same care she brought to all resource questions. "Nothing at the moment," she said. "The stores will last another 2 weeks. The snare line is reliable. The vent is clear." She paused. "The hollow needs a school. There are families staying. There will be more." He looked at her. "I can teach reading and arithmetic," he said. "I know," she said. "I have watched you teach." He left through the lower passage, and Ada sat alone in the chamber and looked at the fire. She did not feel triumph or vindication or the particular satisfaction of watching a system that had ground against her finally turn the other direction. Those were feelings for people who had been waiting for something external to resolve their situation. She had not been waiting. She had been working. The spring came slowly to Sawtooth Hollow that year, releasing its grip on the ground in stages the way the mountain did everything on its own terms according to its own requirements. The snow line retreated up the ridges. The willow thicket showed green at the branch tips. The spring behind the chamber's east wall ran faster with the snow melt. Ada built her cabin on high ground above the falls. She chose the site with the same methodology she had used to choose the chamber's sleeping enclosure, highest point available on dry ground, natural windbreak to the north aspect that caught the morning light access to the spring without requiring a significant daily descent. She felled the timber herself, selecting only what she needed cutting clean. She traded cured hides with a freighter passing through the hollow for nails and a steel blade for the door. She laid the foundation stones from the talus field below the cliff. The cabin was small and well made and entirely hers. The chamber behind Raven Fall remained part of her life. She maintained it through each subsequent season, checking the vent passage in the fall, clearing the lower entrance after heavy snow replacing the rawhide curtains when they wore through, keeping the shelves raised and the drainage trench clear. She added to the temperature record on the wall through each winter that followed, building a record that would tell the story of the hollow's climate over years rather than weeks, information useful to anyone farming or trapping or building in the valley below. Bethel Webb arrived on the first morning warm enough to make the climb without risk. She came alone, carrying the coat folded over her arm, the same coat she had tried to give Ada outside the Coldridge mess hall on the morning of the expulsion, the coat that Harlan had prevented her from delivering. She had kept it through the entire winter on a peg beside her bed, brushing the snow from it on the mornings it collected on the shoulders, waiting for this morning. She held it out without preamble. Ada took it. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the heavy canvas exterior, the wool lining the particular solidity of something built to last in genuine cold. Then she hung it on the wooden peg she had set into the cabin wall beside the door. She did not put it on immediately. She simply hung it there where she could see it from inside whenever the door was open, and from outside whenever she came back from the snare line or the spring or the lower chamber. "You kept it the whole winter," Ada said. "I did," Bethel said. "You didn't have to." "No," Bethel said. "I didn't." They sat together in the early spring light for a while in the way of two people who understand each other well enough that conversation is supplementary rather than necessary. Corder Gant delivered the wage settlement before the spring was out. A bank draft on the territorial account, accompanied by a written accounting of how the figure had been reached and what records it was based on. He did not make a speech. He handed her the draft, shook her hand, and mentioned that Silver Run would be interested in any survey work she was willing to undertake in the upper hollow, given her evident familiarity with the terrain. She told him she would consider it. She considered it and accepted, and spent 2 summers mapping the upper watershed in a way that proved more precise than most of what the Territorial Land Office received from professional surveyors. 3 subsequent mining claims and a timber operation used her documentation as their primary reference. She charged a fair rate for the work, and saved what she did not need, and spent what she did, and the arithmetic of it remained entirely legible to her at all times. The school Stellan built in the hollow opened in the fall of that year, funded in part by contributions from the former Coldridge workers who had remained in the valley, and in part by a grant from the Territorial Education Fund that Stellan had applied for with the tenacity of a man who understood bureaucratic paperwork and was not above using that understanding. He taught reading, writing, and arithmetic to the children of the hollow, and on Friday afternoons to several adults who had never had the opportunity when they were young. Ada taught on Saturdays. She taught what the chamber had taught her, rendered into language that did not require living through it to understand. Keep tinder in more than one location. Distribution reduces catastrophic loss from a single failure. Never place a sleeping surface directly against cold stone. The contact conducts warmth away faster than any covering can replace it. Test your draft before you build your fire. Large or small flame tells you what a large one will do without costing. What a large one costs if it goes wrong. Understand the difference between making heat and keeping heat, because that difference is the difference between effort and engineering. Her students were farmers, trappers, freighters, and the children of all 3. People who lived close enough to the conditions she described that the lessons arrived with the recognition of something already half understood, brought into clarity for the first time. Ezra Cord attended the Saturday sessions twice, decided he had nothing to learn from them, and then came back a 3rd time. He sat in the back and said nothing for 2 hours. Then he asked a question about the airflow principles behind the Shoshone vent notation system on the deer hide map that kept the session going for another hour past its scheduled end. He helped Ada copy the map. It was careful work, because the hide was more fragile now than when she had first found it, and the oldest markings required angled light and time to read correctly. They worked on it over several weeks in the chamber where the conditions were stable enough to handle the material safely. Ezra identified the oldest symbols, the ones that predated the Trapper editions by decades, possibly more, and provided context from 40 years of traveling through territory where people who understood these marking systems had lived and moved and maintained these places. Stellan organized what they assembled into a clean record, cross-referenced with Ada's observational notes. The map showed where things were. Ada's notes explained how they worked. Together, they constituted something none of the 3 could have produced individually. A document that was both historical record and practical guide, grounded in the specific terrain of the hollow and the accumulated intelligence of everyone who had ever needed that terrain to keep them alive. They kept the location of the chamber itself from general knowledge. Not exactly secret people in the hollow gradually understood that something significant existed behind Raven Fall, without knowing its precise nature but not advertised. Ezra had the clearest instinct about this. Some knowledge survived because it was shared carefully, passed to people who would use it well and maintain it and pass it on with the same care. Knowledge broadcast indiscriminately became something people visited and depleted rather than maintained and contributed to. The chamber would outlast all of them if it was managed correctly. The entries on the wall accumulated through the subsequent winters. Each one followed the same format Ada had established on the first night, because the format was functional and she saw no reason to change what worked. Date. Outside temperature. Interior temperature at the sleeping position. Fuel consumed. Conditions noted. Any modifications made to the system. They did not record feelings. They recorded facts. This was not because the feelings were absent or unimportant. It was because the record served a different purpose. It served the person who would come after, who needed to know what worked and under what conditions and at what cost. Not How Ada had felt about the cold on the 9th day or the 22nd or the morning. Harlan Drum had bowed his head beneath her rawhide curtain and walked back out into a world that had already begun to settle its accounts without him. On the peg beside the cabin door, Bethel Webb's coat hung through every season that came after. Canvas and wool, built for serious cold, present every morning when Ada opened the door into whatever the mountain had prepared for that day. It had been offered once as charity in a room where charity was dangerous. It was not charity anymore. It was simply hers, earned in the only currency that the mountain recognized, which was the currency of showing up every day and doing the work that the day required, regardless of whether anyone was watching and regardless of what anyone had decided you were worth before you began. The wall of the chamber held the first entry through all the years of additions that followed. Faded but legible, the charcoal pressed deep enough into the stone's surface to resist the seasons. 9 marks. Temperature outside. Temperature at the sleeping position. Fuel consumed. Smoke clean. Hides dry. Everything she had done. Nothing she had felt. The numbers did not tell the story of what she had survived. They told the story of what she had built, which was a different story. And in the end, a better one, because survival ends when the danger passes. But what you build from it, if you build it right, has a way of outlasting everything that tried to prevent it.